Chapter 1. Rise of Macedonia. The sun had long set on the golden age of classical Greece. The great city-states, once dazzling centers of art, philosophy, and valor, were now weary from endless infighting. The Peloponnesian War, a catastrophic struggle between Athens and Sparta, had drained their spirit and blood. What followed was not peace, but decay. A series of petty wars, broken alliances, and missed chances for unity. The brilliant minds of Socrates and Sophocles had laid the foundations of Western thought, but their homeland now lay fractured and vulnerable. In this power vacuum to the north, amid the rugged terrain of the Balkans, stood a kingdom the southern Greeks scoffed at: Macedonia. It was dismissed as a cultural backwater, where men wore beards too long and spoke a dialect the Athenians found coarse. Yet this mountainous frontier bred resilience. Life here was not debated in marble forums but forged on horseback, in the forests, and across jagged passes. And in this unlikely land, destiny had found a new home. That destiny took human form in King Philip II, a shrewd, visionary leader hardened by exile and war. Trained in Thebes, where he observed the great general Epaminondas reshape the art of battle, Philip returned to Macedonia not merely to reign, but to rebuild. The kingdom he inherited was fragile and beset by enemies, but under his command, it would rise like iron from the forge. Philip's transformation of the Macedonian army was nothing short of revolutionary. He understood that in warfare, discipline mattered more than numbers, and innovation more than brute strength. He armed his infantry with the sarissa, a pike nearly twice the length of a traditional Greek spear, and drilled them into tight, impenetrable phalanxes. Each soldier was a cog in a precise machine, designed to grind down the enemy with relentless force. The sarissa phalanx was terrifying on the battlefield, but it was not Philip's only stroke of genius. He paired it with fast, decisive cavalry attacks and siege technology unmatched in the Greek world. War became less a matter of honor and more of strategy, logistics, and overwhelming force. Under Philip, Macedonia became a military power few dared challenge. But Philip was not just a warlord. He was a master of politics and persuasion. He used marriage alliances, diplomacy, and calculated aggression to bring Greek city-states to heel. Some joined him willingly, others were subdued by steel. Yet all recognized that a new order was forming, one that did not revolve around Athens or Sparta, but around Pella, Philip's capital. The defining moment came at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. Here, Philip's reformed army faced the combined might of Athens and Thebes, who had set aside old rivalries to stop the Macedonian tide. Among Philip's commanders that day was his 18-year-old son, Alexander, who led a decisive cavalry charge. The Greek coalition was crushed, their spirit broken, and their independence relegated to memory. In the aftermath, Philip called for unity not as conqueror but as visionary. He founded the Hellenic League, also known as the League of Corinth, binding most of the Greek world under his leadership. Sparta alone refused to bow. The goal he presented was bold and seductive: a united Greek crusade to avenge the old Persian invasions and seize the wealth of the East. The campaign against Persia was more than revenge. It was a symbol of Greek pride, now reborn under Macedonian guidance. Philip saw himself not just as a king of Macedonia, but as the spearhead of a pan-Hellenic revival. In this vision, old rivalries would dissolve, and the divided would become mighty. But fate had other plans. On the eve of his great campaign, Philip was struck down, not by Persian blade, but by his own bodyguard at a wedding celebration. The motives remain a mystery, tangled in court intrigue, jealousy, and the brutal undercurrents of Macedonian politics. The kingdom mourned, but power would not wait. In his place stepped Alexander, just 20 years old, brilliant, and battle-tested. The boy who had once tamed Bucephalus and studied under Aristotle now stood as the torchbearer of his father's grand design. But before claiming the crown of Asia, he would need to secure the one he wore in Macedonia. Alexander moved with swiftness and certainty. He eliminated rivals at home and then turned to rebellious cities with fury. When Thebes rose against him, he responded with utter annihilation, leveling the ancient city and selling its survivors into slavery. It was a brutal warning to all. The boy was king, and the king would not be challenged. Despite his youth, Alexander possessed a charisma and strategic genius that inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure. He inherited his father's army, but quickly made it his own, imbuing it with his relentless drive for glory and conquest. The shadow of Philip loomed large, but Alexander was determined to surpass it. Thus, from a once-dismissed kingdom in the north, emerged a force the world could no longer ignore. Macedonia, under Philip and now Alexander, had transformed from ridiculed periphery to imperial vanguard. The age of petty Greek feuds was over. A new age was dawning, an age of ambition, conquest, and destiny. And so, with the winds of history at his back and the armies of a unified Greece at his side, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. Beyond the Aegean, beyond Asia Minor, beyond what the Greeks called the edge of the world, his journey was about to begin. Chapter 2. The invasion begins. Spring of 334 BC dawned not with quiet farming or ritual celebration in Macedonia, but with the thunder of hooves and the clatter of spears. Across the Hellespont, the narrow sea that separates Europe from Asia, a new force prepared to cross. At its head was a 20-year-old king with a lion's heart and his father's ambition etched into every step. Alexander of Macedon was no longer securing his rule. He was about to reshape the known world. The campaign had the air of prophecy. Before embarking, Alexander is said to have offered sacrifices at Troy, honoring Achilles, the legendary Greek hero whom he considered his ancestor. In a poetic gesture, he exchanged his own armor for one kept at the sacred site, symbolizing not only courage but continuity. The message was unmistakable. This was no mere military expedition. It was the rebirth of a heroic age. Alexander's army was a mosaic of the Greek world, 40,000 strong. At its core stood the Macedonian phalanx, professional soldiers trained since youth, armed with the sarissa. They formed a human porcupine, bristling with spears, marching in lockstep. These were not mercenaries who fought for coin, but veterans who fought for glory, their king, and the dream of empire. Commanding the phalanx was the experienced General Parmenion, a man of iron nerves and measured strategy. His sons, including Philotas and Nicanor, played key roles in leading cavalry and elite infantry units. Alexander may have been the vision, but Parmenion was the spine, the steady hand guiding the organized chaos of war. Flanking the phalanx were 3,000 hypaspists, shield-bearers with shorter spears, trained to defend the vulnerable sides of the formation. Nimble and lethal, they protected the phalanx like armor shields a knight. These men were also among the king's most trusted companions, often following him into the most perilous corners of the battlefield. Further bolstering the ranks were 7,000 Greek allies and 5,000 hardened mercenaries. These hoplites carried round shields and shorter spears, less sophisticated than the sarissa, but still a formidable force. Despite regional differences and old grudges, Alexander had united these disparate warriors under one cause, the conquest of Persia. Yet it was the cavalry that gave Alexander his cutting edge. The companion cavalry, 1,800 strong, was his blade. Clad in gleaming armor, mounted on muscular horses, and trained to pivot and charge with deadly precision. These men were handpicked for both loyalty and skill. Alexander himself rode with them, never above the fight, always at its heart. Additional support came from the Thessalian cavalry, skilled riders from the plains of central Greece, Thracians and Paeonians, known for their aggressive shock tactics, and the Agrians, javelin-hurling skirmishers from the mountains of modern Bulgaria. Each contingent brought a unique strength to the army's composite structure. On the opposite shore, the satraps of the Persian Empire were watching, anxious, and divided. The vast empire, once ruled by kings who could summon armies from Egypt to India, now found itself facing a younger, faster enemy. But pride outweighed caution. Rather than heed the wise counsel of Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary general who advised scorched earth, they resolved to meet Alexander in battle. Their chosen battleground was the river Granicus, a shallow but wide body of water, flanked by steep banks and swift currents. A natural barrier turned trap. The Persians believed the river would slow the invaders long enough for a cavalry wall to crush them as they emerged disordered from the crossing. In theory, it was sound. In practice, they had not accounted for Alexander. With calculated daring, Alexander approached the river at twilight. His generals advised caution. Cross at dawn, they said. Rest the men. Reconnoiter the terrain. But Alexander's instinct was forged in fire, not fear. He saw hesitation as poison. That night, under fading stars and rising anticipation, he gave the order, "We cross now." The assault began with a diversion. Companion cavalry plunged into the river to probe the enemy's response. Behind them surged the Hypaspists and Paeonian horsemen, braving the current under a hail of arrows and javelins. The water churned with blood and chaos. The Persians charged down the opposite bank, determined to break the Macedonians before they could organize. Then Alexander entered the fray. He led the charge himself, flanked by his finest warriors. It wasn't just an act of bravery, it was strategic brilliance. His presence galvanized his troops and disrupted the Persian lines. Horses clashed, lances shattered. In the melee, Alexander's helmet was struck, nearly splitting his skull. But he retaliated with the force of myth, killing one noble and escaping another only by the blade of his loyal comrade Clitus the Black. As more Macedonian troops crossed behind him, the Persian cavalry began to buckle. The phalanx advanced with relentless pressure, turning the tide. Soon the riverbank was littered with Persian dead and fleeing horsemen. Behind them, the Greek mercenaries, Persia's hired swords, stood isolated and stunned. Alexander, ignoring pleas for mercy, ordered them cut down to the last man. Traitors, in his eyes, deserved no quarter. By morning, the battlefield had fallen silent. The river Granicus was red with the cost of defiance. Asia Minor, gateway to Persia, lay wide open before Alexander. The invasion had begun not with caution or calculation, but with thunder, and the world was about to feel its reverberations. Chapter 3: Battle of the Granicus. The blood of battle still clung to the banks of the river Granicus as Alexander's army surveyed the field. The victory had been decisive, but it was no ordinary triumph. It was a statement, an opening act written in steel and sacrifice. Persia, once the invincible empire that brought Greece to its knees, had been shattered in its own land by a 20-year-old king from the north. The myth of Persian invulnerability had begun to crack. News of the defeat swept through Asia Minor like a storm. City after city opened its gates to Alexander, some out of admiration, others from fear. Sardis, capital of Lydia and one of Persia's most prized possessions, surrendered without a fight. Its satrap offered the city, its fortress, and its vast treasury to the young conqueror. Alexander accepted with grace, but the message was clear. Persia's grip was loosening. Despite the victory, Alexander understood that military force alone would not secure the region. He moved quickly to establish control, appointing new governors, leaving garrisons, and granting autonomy to cities willing to accept Macedonian rule. His goal was not to plunder and depart, but to inherit. He saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as the rightful heir to an empire. Yet, even in triumph, Alexander did not rest. He turned his eyes to the coastal cities that supported the Persian navy, cities like Miletus and Halicarnassus. Controlling the land meant little if the sea remained hostile. Memnon of Rhodes, still in Persian service, had taken command of naval defenses and was organizing resistance. The threat was real. A Persian fleet could sever Alexander's lifeline back to Greece. Rather than confront the Persian fleet on water, a domain where Persia still held supremacy, Alexander pursued a strategy of annihilation by land. He laid siege to Miletus, cutting it off from the sea with siege towers and blockade lines. The city fell swiftly, but Halicarnassus, home to towering fortifications and reinforced by Memnon himself, proved far more stubborn. The siege of Halicarnassus dragged into the winter months. The defenders fought with desperation, launching night raids and setting siege equipment ablaze. Yet Alexander, relentless and methodical, pressed on. His engineers, trained in the Macedonian art of siegecraft, wore down the defenses. Finally, the city cracked, and the remnants of Memnon's army set it alight as they fled. The flames of Halicarnassus lit the sky, marking the end of Persia's naval strongholds in the region. With the coast secured, Alexander turned inland once more. In Lycia and Phrygia, he advanced through rugged terrain and complex alliances. Many cities submitted willingly, often persuaded more by his reputation than by force. Where diplomacy failed, the Macedonian phalanx spoke with terrifying clarity. Alexander moved not like a raider, but like a rising storm, slow, certain, and impossible to ignore. At Gordium, the capital of ancient Phrygia, Alexander encountered a legend. A knot so complex that prophecy claimed only the future ruler of Asia could unravel it. The Gordian knot had defeated all who tried, its cords coiled into an impossible tangle. As courtiers and priests looked on, Alexander stood before it, paused, and then drew his sword. With a single stroke, he cleaved the knot in two. Whether it was an act of impatience or divine symbolism, history would remember it as an omen. The boy king would not be bound by the past. Meanwhile, Memnon's campaign continued across the Aegean. He captured islands, inspired rebellion in Greece, and for a moment, it seemed the Persian strategy might yet strangle Alexander's advance. But fate intervened. Memnon fell ill and died suddenly, a blow that crippled Persian coordination at sea. Alexander, now with fewer threats to his rear, pressed forward. 18 months had passed since Alexander had first stepped onto Asian soil. He had marched through fire and storm, through plains, rivers, and walled cities. He had faced cavalry charges, rebellions, and political intrigue. And yet, he had not lost a single battle. For his enemies, he was becoming a phantom, unstoppable, unpredictable, and ever advancing. But greater trials awaited. Beyond the Nur Mountains lay Cilicia and Syria, lands of deeper Persian roots and richer power. And from the heart of the empire, the great King Darius III was finally on the move. No longer content to let satraps bear the burden of war, he now raised a massive army and sought to trap the Macedonian king from the rear. Alexander's scouts soon reported Darius's position, north of his own, between him and his supply lines. The hunter had become the hunted. Alexander's army now found itself facing the terrifying possibility of being cut off, cornered, and crushed. The narrow plain of Issus, wedged between the sea and the mountains, would become the stage for a battle unlike any before. And so the invasion, which had begun with reckless courage at the Granicus, now stood on the brink of annihilation or ascension. Darius commanded an army twice the size of Alexander's. The Macedonian king would either fall into legend or rise above it. The fate of empires would soon be decided in the shadow of the mountains. Chapter 4. Clash with Darius, the Battle of Issus. The winds off the Gulf of Issus carried the scent of salt and fire as Alexander's army descended from the passes of the Nur Mountains into the narrow plain. It was autumn, 333 BC. The air was heavy with anticipation. What awaited Alexander on the strip of land between mountain and sea was no mere skirmish or fortified town. It was the might of Persia itself, led by Darius III, the great king in person. For the first time, Alexander would face the living embodiment of the empire he had come to conquer. Darius had chosen his battlefield with cunning. The plain at Issus was narrow, only 6 miles wide, and hemmed in by impassable ridges to the east and the coastline to the west. His strategy was clear: trap Alexander in the tight space and unleash overwhelming numbers. Estimates of the Persian force vary, but some ancient sources claim more than 100,000 soldiers stood under the royal banner, including the elite Immortals, Persian household troops famed for their discipline and power. The Persian formation was broad and bristling. On the right, near the sea, Darius massed his best cavalry, hoping to break through Alexander's flank quickly. In the center, heavily armed Greek mercenaries, hardened veterans with little loyalty beyond their coin, stood ready to clash phalanx with phalanx. Darius himself, surrounded by his guard and nobility, took his place behind them in a golden chariot, a symbol of divine authority and absolute power. Alexander was outnumbered, but not outmatched. He understood terrain as well as any general in history. The narrowness of the plain, meant to limit his movement, also restricted Darius's ability to deploy his full strength. Rather than be encircled, Alexander saw an opportunity to channel Persian power into a narrow corridor, where discipline, not numbers, would prevail. The Macedonian army formed into its traditional alignment. On the left, near the sea, Parmenion commanded the Greek and Thessalian cavalry. The phalanx held the center, layer upon layer of sarissa-wielding soldiers forming a mobile wall of iron. On the right, Alexander placed his finest. His companion cavalry, the hypaspists, the archers, and the deadly Agrian skirmishers, all arrayed near the slopes. Alexander knew where the decisive blow would come, and he would be there to deliver it himself. Before the battle, Alexander rode along his lines, calling out names of men he knew, praising acts of valor past, stoking courage with every word. He reminded them that they had crossed the Hellespont not just to fight, but to change the world. The men answered with cheers, slamming their shields and spears. The air was alive with fury and resolve. Then, with the signal given, Alexander advanced, slowly at first, testing the Persian line, looking for the pulse of the battlefield. But when he saw an opening on the Persian left, he acted with the speed of a predator. At the head of the companion cavalry, he led a thunderous charge, slamming into the enemy flank and sending a tremor through the entire Persian formation. Yet the center held firm. The Macedonian phalanx, in its eagerness to keep pace with Alexander, had become stretched and disordered. The Greek mercenaries under Persian command seized their chance, pressing forward with spear and shield. The clash was brutal. Men fell by the dozens, and for a moment, it seemed the Macedonian line might break. Alexander saw the danger and pivoted. Rather than chase glory, he turned his horse and led his men directly into the fray, smashing into the enemy center to relieve the embattled phalanx. The Persian mercenaries, caught between advancing spears and charging cavalry, began to buckle. Discipline fractured. Formation collapsed. The center was collapsing, just as Alexander had intended. Then came the moment of unraveling. Darius, watching from his chariot, saw his lines folding and panic spreading. Whether through cowardice or calculation, he turned and fled the battlefield. The golden chariot, meant to symbolize divine strength, now clattered away in retreat, trailing dust and disgrace. The great king had abandoned his men. Across the battlefield, Persian morale shattered. The right flank, engaged with Parmenion's cavalry, now found itself isolated. Fierce fighting continued, but without the command structure and spirit that Darius's presence provided, it turned into a rout. The Persians ran not as soldiers but as hunted men. The river Panaris, once a line of defense, became a barrier to their escape. In the aftermath, the cost became clear. Thousands of Persians lay dead or wounded. Among the living, Alexander captured Darius's family, his wife, mother, and children, all treated with unexpected dignity. The symbolism was powerful. While Darius fled, Alexander stood victorious, yet merciful. He was more than a conqueror. He was beginning to cast himself as a king. The Battle of Issus had changed everything. It was no longer just a campaign of raids and occupation. It was now a war of kings. Alexander had faced the heart of Persian power and emerged triumphant. In one stroke, he had not only crippled the enemy's military strength, but also humiliated its divine ruler before the eyes of the world. And yet, Alexander knew this was only the beginning. The great king had escaped, and as long as he lived, the empire could still rise again. But for now, Alexander had the momentum, the legend, and the eyes of every city between Syria and the Euphrates fixed on him. He would not stop. He could not stop. The road ahead was long, but the fire had already been lit. With Issus behind him, Alexander now turned toward the Phoenician coast, not to rest, but to strip Persia of its greatest weapon, control of the sea. Victory was no longer enough. He would unravel the empire piece by piece, until nothing remained but memory and ashes. Chapter 5: Siege and Conquest of Tyre and Gaza. In the wake of his stunning victory at Issus, Alexander pressed southward with relentless determination. He had crippled the Persian army, shattered its image of invincibility, and seized the loyalty or fear of many cities. Yet one vital piece of the empire's war machine remained untouched: the Persian navy. Though routed on land, Darius's forces still commanded the sea. And as long as the great naval bases of the eastern Mediterranean remained intact, Persia could still strike at his rear. Alexander's answer was as strategic as it was ambitious. He would not challenge the Persian fleet head-on in open waters. Instead, he would dismantle it by conquering every port city along the coast. Without harbors to resupply or anchor in, even the mightiest fleet would be rendered useless. Thus began a new phase of the campaign, not of grand battles, but of sieges, sweat, and unyielding patience. The Phoenician cities, proud coastal kingdoms renowned for their seafaring heritage, were his next targets. Many surrendered without resistance, awed by his victories and eager to avoid destruction. But Tyre, the jewel of Phoenicia, refused to kneel. This ancient city sat on an island half a mile offshore, protected by towering walls and a powerful fleet. Its rulers believed themselves beyond Alexander's reach. To most generals, Tyre would have been untouchable. But Alexander was not most generals. If the sea would not carry him to Tyre, then he would bring the land to the sea. He ordered the construction of a causeway, an artificial bridge stretching from the mainland to the island's walls. With each day, the sea was tamed by stone, timber, and determination. But Tyre did not remain idle. Its navy, still active and deadly, launched attacks against the growing mole. Fire ships scorched siege towers. Archers and catapults rained destruction on the workers. Storms wrecked days of labor in a single night. Yet Alexander never faltered. He responded with innovation: shielded towers, new siege engines, and eventually the capture of Allied ships to blockade the island. The siege dragged on for 7 grueling months. Frustration mounted on both sides. But Alexander's will, like the mole stretching toward the island, proved unstoppable. Finally, a breach was made in the walls. Macedonian troops stormed through, their fury fed by months of resistance and hardship. Tyre fell in a storm of blood. Thousands were slain, and survivors were sold into slavery. It was a brutal end, but one Alexander deemed necessary, to make it known that no defiance would go unanswered. From the ashes of Tyre, Alexander marched onward to Gaza, the gateway to Egypt. Perched on a strategic plateau and heavily fortified, Gaza too chose resistance. The defenders believed the rocky cliffs would shield them. Once again, they underestimated Alexander's ingenuity. The Macedonians dragged siege towers across the desert, building ramps under withering fire. Alexander himself was wounded during the assault, struck through the shoulder by a catapult bolt. Yet even from his sickbed he directed the attack. He refused to pause. After 2 months of savage fighting, Gaza fell. Its leader, Battus, was captured alive, but when he refused to submit, Alexander reportedly tied him behind a chariot and dragged him around the city walls in a grim echo of Homeric vengeance. With Gaza subdued, the road to Egypt lay open, and Egypt, ancient, storied, and long oppressed by Persian rule, welcomed Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. At Pelusium, the Persian governor surrendered without resistance. At Memphis, the high priests hailed Alexander as a divine son. In their eyes, he was not Macedonian or Greek, but the rebirth of pharaonic power, chosen by the gods. Alexander embraced the role with characteristic flair. In Egyptian ceremony, he was crowned pharaoh, the living god-king, protector of Maat and ruler of the two lands. This coronation was more than symbolism, it was a political masterstroke. By adopting local traditions, Alexander ensured loyalty not just through fear, but through legitimacy. At the mouth of the Nile, he founded a new city, Alexandria. Designed as a beacon of Hellenistic culture and power, it would become one of the most influential cities in ancient history. Its location was ideal, protected harbors, fertile delta, and a crossroad between continents. Here, Alexander's vision began to take physical form, but his ambitions stretched far beyond pyramids and priesthoods. He journeyed into the desert to the Oracle of Siwa, seeking confirmation of his divine favor. According to some accounts, the oracle greeted him not as mortal king, but as the son of Zeus Ammon, the supreme deity of Egypt and Greece. The words, whether myth or truth, sealed something deep within him, a belief in his own destiny as a man touched by the gods. By now, Alexander had reshaped the world more than any living ruler. He had destroyed Tyre, taken Egypt without a battle, and stood crowned by two civilizations. Yet he was not finished. News arrived from Greece that reminded him his rule was still contested in the Old World. King Agis of Sparta, with Persian gold and ancient pride, had raised a revolt. Greece was stirring, but even this rebellion would not shake the foundation he had laid. As Alexander prepared to leave Egypt and return to the warpath, he did so not as a Macedonian king, but as something far greater, a unifier of East and West, a god in the eyes of men, and the architect of an empire no map had yet dared to draw. Chapter 6. Alexander in Egypt. The desert winds of Egypt whispered through the columns of Memphis as Alexander made preparations to depart. But his time in this ancient land had been more than symbolic, it was transformational. Here, he had not only secured a province, but inherited a legacy. The Egyptians had given him more than titles. They had given him legitimacy, wrapping his identity in the golden thread of divine kingship. To the Macedonians, he was a conqueror. To the Egyptians, he was pharaoh. To himself, he was beginning to believe he was something more. His founding of Alexandria was not a passing gesture, but a deliberate act of empire building. Situated between the Mediterranean Sea and the Nile, the city was planned with precision, broad streets, massive harbors, and a lighthouse that would one day become a wonder of the world. It was to be a living bridge between Greek and Egyptian culture, a bastion of Hellenistic power long after Alexander himself would be gone. Though he would never return to it, Alexandria was one of his greatest and most enduring creations. But before he could leave Egypt, Alexander sought divine affirmation. He set out across the western desert toward the Oracle of Siwa, a sacred site nestled among dunes and salt lakes. The journey was perilous. Sandstorms, mirages, and thirst haunted every step. Yet he pressed on, accompanied by a small escort. Legend claims that serpents guided him and that the god himself protected him from harm. Whether literal or metaphorical, the desert did not break him. At the sanctuary of Ammon, where the Egyptian god was fused with Zeus in a hybrid deity of East and West, Alexander received the oracle's blessing. The priests are said to have greeted him as son of Ammon. The message, though cryptic, was enough. Alexander emerged from the temple with a newfound gravity. To his followers, he returned a king. To himself he returned a god. Such divine pretensions did not yet dominate his public image, but they had taken root in his mind. This was not mere arrogance, it was strategy. By embodying different roles to different peoples, he was weaving himself into the spiritual and political fabric of his empire. Macedonians followed their general. Egyptians worshipped their pharaoh. And the Greeks, even if skeptical, could not deny the trail of victories that grew only longer with time. Back in Tyre, Alexander began gathering his forces for the next phase of his conquest. But as preparations were underway, urgent news arrived from across the Aegean. Sparta had risen. Led by King Agis III and funded by Persian gold, a rebellion had taken hold in the Peloponnese. This was more than political instability, it was a direct threat to Alexander's power base in Greece. Yet he did not panic. In his absence, he had left Antipater, a seasoned general and loyal steward, in charge of Macedonia. Antipater moved swiftly, crushing a Thracian uprising before marching south to confront the Spartans. The two forces met near Megalopolis in a fierce battle. The Spartans, once the terror of the Greek world, were now shadows of their former selves. Agis fought bravely but was slain. The rebellion collapsed. Greece, for now, was Alexander's once more. Even in distant Egypt, Alexander's influence reached back like an invisible tide, quelling unrest without his direct command. His empire, still young, was already learning to walk on its own. And with his rear now secure, he turned his gaze eastward once more, toward the heart of Persia and the man who had once fled from Issus. The time for chasing satraps and taking port cities was over. Darius still lived. The great king had not given up, and in the vast reaches of Mesopotamia, he was building another army, larger, more disciplined, and determined to reclaim his throne. This would not be a battle of defense. It would be a reckoning. One final contest between the two greatest rulers of their time. Alexander began the march with precision and momentum. He moved through Syria, through ancient trade routes and fortified cities, seizing control of supply lines and outposts with barely a struggle. Everywhere he went, Persian authority seemed to melt away. Some cities resisted and were crushed. Others capitulated without a fight. The legend of Alexander was now spreading faster than his armies. In early 331 BC, he reached the Euphrates. Before him lay the heartland of Persia, the rich plains of Mesopotamia, home to Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. Here, Darius had chosen to make his stand. He had abandoned narrow valleys and coastal traps. This time, the battlefield would be open. This time, numbers would tell. This time, the Persian king would not flee. But Alexander was no longer the impetuous youth who had charged across the Granicus. He was now seasoned, tempered by siege and storm, victory and loss. His tactics had evolved. His confidence had deepened. He would meet Darius not with hope, but with certainty. The final confrontation was coming, and the fates of two empires, two kings, and perhaps even history itself, would be decided on the plains near a place called Gaugamela. Chapter 7. The Battle of Gaugamela. The plains of Gaugamela stretched wide beneath the Mesopotamian sun. Flat, featureless, and deceptively still. It was here, in the autumn of 331 BC, that the world would witness a clash unlike any before. On one side stood Darius III, the great king of Persia, commanding the vast resources of an empire that had stood for centuries. On the other, Alexander, the 25-year-old Macedonian king whose unbroken string of victories had turned him into a living legend. This would not be a mere battle for land, it was a war for legacy. Darius had learned from Issus. He chose this battlefield himself and ordered it meticulously prepared. The terrain was cleared and flattened to favor his most fearsome weapons. Scythe chariots, designed to cut through infantry with whirling blades, and even war elephants, monstrous beasts from the east meant to terrify and trample. His army, drawn from every corner of the empire, may have numbered between 50,000 and 80,000 men. some say more. Syrians, Babylonians, Bactrians, Indians, Scythians, all stood beneath the royal banner, their armor glinting in the desert light. Alexander, too, had prepared. His force was smaller, perhaps half the size of the Persian army, but honed to a razor's edge. The Macedonian phalanx, veterans of every battle since the Hellespont, formed the impenetrable core. On the left, Parmenion commanded Thessalian and Thracian cavalry. On the right, Alexander led the companion cavalry, supported by hypaspists and archers, the instruments of his signature hammer blow. But Alexander's genius was never in brute strength. It was in movement. As both armies drew up for battle, he shifted his right wing out to the flank, not in retreat, but in provocation. Darius, fearing envelopment, mirrored the movement, spreading his line thinner and unknowingly opening his center. It was the first step in a trap set with the calm of a chess master. Darius made the first move. His scythe chariots thundered forward, blades spinning, dust rising. The sight was meant to terrify, but the Macedonians had planned for this. As the chariots approached, Agrian's javelin throwers and archers sprang into action, striking horses and drivers. The phalanx, instead of bracing, opened lanes, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through. What should have been a storm of iron became a fluttering gust, absorbed by precision and training. With Darius distracted and his front weakened, Alexander struck. At the head of his companion cavalry, he wheeled sharply left and charged straight into the exposed Persian center. The blow was devastating. The Macedonian phalanx advanced with perfect timing, supporting the breach. Darius's elite guard, the Immortals, resisted fiercely, but the center could not hold. As panic spread, Darius once again fled, abandoning his chariot in the chaos. The symbolism was unbearable. The great king, for the second time, had turned his back on battle. His army's cohesion shattered. The center dissolved. The momentum belonged wholly to Alexander. But not all was secure. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion faced a desperate fight. Waves of Persian cavalry, including Indian and Scythian horsemen, had overwhelmed the flank. At one point, they even broke through and reached the Macedonian rear, threatening to encircle the entire army and plunder the baggage train. Parmenion sent an urgent message to Alexander. At that moment, the king was chasing the fleeing Darius. His enemy within reach, the war's end nearly in his grasp. But duty overrode glory. Alexander halted the pursuit, turned his forces, and rushed to aid Parmenion. What followed was the fiercest hand-to-hand combat of the day, bloody, chaotic, and personal. The companion cavalry lost dozens of men, many of them close friends of the king. Eventually, the Persian cavalry collapsed under pressure. They were broken by the spreading news of Darius's flight. The battlefield transformed into a sea of wreckage, dead men, shattered weapons, fleeing horses. Alexander had won, and not merely by survival. He had utterly destroyed the last great Persian army. There would be no coming back from this. In the aftermath, Alexander's losses were shockingly low for such a massive encounter. Only a few hundred men, while Persian casualties may have numbered in the tens of thousands. But numbers alone could not capture the magnitude of the victory. The road to Babylon, the beating heart of the empire, now lay open. The gates of one of the world's oldest cities would soon welcome him not as invader, but as king. Darius, meanwhile, fled east again, toward the mountains and into the shadows of history. His power broken, his throne forsaken, he became a fugitive in his own empire. Alexander did not need to chase him to know that he now ruled Persia in all but name. But the young king understood the weight of what had just occurred. On the sands of Gaugamela, the old world had died. The Achaemenid Empire, which had once stretched from the Nile to the Indus, had been felled by a boy from the mountains of Macedonia. With one battle, the torch of civilization had passed hands. Yet Alexander was not content to hold what he had taken. the ruins of an empire were not enough. There were still cities to tame, cultures to absorb, and the legacy of conquest to complete. For him, Gaugamela was not the end. It was the beginning of something even greater, the transformation of the East under Hellenistic rule, guided by one man's insatiable vision. He had claimed the Persian throne with sword and strategy. Now he would ride toward Babylon, Persepolis, and beyond, not as a conqueror of cities, but as a shaper of worlds. Chapter 8: Fall of the Persian Empire. The gates of Babylon, ancient and immense, opened not with resistance but with reverence. The priests, nobles, and citizens came forth in procession, bringing offerings, flowers, and tokens of loyalty. Alexander, not as a plunderer but as a king, entered the city once called the Jewel of the East. He was now the master of an empire he had only begun to understand, a realm older than Greece itself, steeped in gods, kings, and endless lines of tradition. Inside Babylon's great ziggurats, beneath the ceiling of painted stars, Alexander took his place not merely as a conqueror but as a ruler who sought legitimacy. Persian officials swore fealty. Temples were restored. The wounded were treated with care. This was no wild sack of a defeated city. It was ceremony, the first step in Alexander's transformation from warrior to world emperor. From Babylon, he moved swiftly to Susa, the Persian Empire's ceremonial capital, where even more riches awaited. The famed royal treasury, bursting with silver and gold, was now his. But Alexander did not hoard it. Instead, he distributed vast sums to his soldiers, repaying debts and rewarding loyalty. It was both gratitude and strategy, an empire held together by both steel and coin. His next destination was the city most symbolic of Persia's greatness, Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Achaemenid power. But unlike Babylon, Persepolis resisted. As Alexander's army climbed into the Zagros Mountains, they faced dogged resistance at a narrow defile known as the Persian Gates. There, a Persian commander named Ariobarzanes made a final, heroic stand. For nearly a month, the Macedonian advance was stalled. The narrow pass became a killing ground, with the terrain favoring defenders who knew every cliff and stone. But Alexander, as always, adapted. Aided by local guides, he discovered a hidden path that allowed his forces to encircle the defenders. The Persians fought to the last. The pass fell. The road to Persepolis was now clear. When Alexander arrived at the city, he was struck by its grandeur. Its palaces, its staircases etched with images of tribute-bearers from distant lands, its ceremonial halls where generations of kings had been crowned. But beneath the awe, there burned a deeper fire, revenge. Nearly 150 years earlier, the Persians had burned the temples of Athens. Now Alexander would return the gesture. In a night that history would never forget, Persepolis was set ablaze. The royal palace was engulfed in flames, its stone walls glowing in the firelight like the ruins of Olympus. Whether it was a calculated act of retribution or a drunken celebration gone too far, none could say. What remained clear was that the symbolic heart of Persia had been reduced to ash. Yet Alexander was not merely destroying, he was building. Even amid the ruins, he began appointing satraps and administrators, many of them Persians loyal to him. He knew that governing such a vast land required more than Macedonian swords. By preserving Persian institutions while embedding Greek control, he was shaping the future. A fusion of East and West, ruled by one hand, yet familiar to all. Still, there remained unfinished business. Darius, though stripped of power, still lived. He had fled further east, seeking to gather a final resistance in the far provinces of Media, Parthia, and Bactria. Alexander would not allow the illusion of dual kingship to continue. He gave chase, relentless, determined, and aware that with Darius's death, the Achaemenid dynasty would end. But before Alexander could reach him, betrayal struck. In the remote lands of Bactria, Darius was arrested and then murdered by one of his own governors, Bessus, who proclaimed himself the new king. Alexander was furious. He had wished to capture Darius alive, to stand over him in the eyes of history, not to find him abandoned, pierced, and dying in the dust. When Alexander discovered the body of Darius, he ordered it honorably buried in the royal tombs of Persepolis, alongside his ancestors. It was a gesture that stunned Persians and Greeks alike. He had not just defeated his enemy, he had respected him as a fallen king. In that act, Alexander claimed something greater than victory: heirship, not just of lands, but of legacy. Now, with no rival to challenge his rule, Alexander turned inward to consolidate his domain. He appointed new satraps, often blending Macedonian oversight with Persian continuity. Local nobles were retained, cities were reorganized, and infrastructure repaired. His governance was swift, flexible, and deeply strategic. And yet, not all was peaceful. Whispers of unrest simmered in the eastern provinces. Bessus, though disgraced, still had allies. Sogdia, Bactria, and the edges of Central Asia would not surrender easily. The mountains bred resistance. Tribes who had never bowed to Persia now looked at Alexander with suspicion, not awe. Before pressing eastward, Alexander gave those weary of war a choice. Those who had served long could return home. Some took the offer. Others stayed, drawn by loyalty, glory, or curiosity. For those who remained, their king's ambition had no limit. The edge of the known world still lay beyond the horizon. And Alexander, pharaoh of Egypt, king of Persia, lord of Asia, had only just begun to chase it. Chapter 9. Into the heart of Central Asia. With the death of Darius, Alexander's claim to the Persian throne was complete. He had defeated the Achaemenid dynasty in battle, buried its last king with royal honors, and absorbed its court and traditions. Yet even as the empire bowed to him in name, its eastern provinces burned with rebellion. The rugged lands of Arya, Bactria, and Sogdia, modern Afghanistan and Central Asia, were wild and defiant, shaped by mountains, tribal allegiances, and a deep resistance to foreign rule. Alexander began his eastern campaign by marching into Arya, where the local satrap Satabarzanes, after feigning loyalty, rose in revolt. The rebellion was swift and fierce, but Alexander's response was faster. In a dramatic encounter, Satabarzanes challenged a Greek officer to single combat and was slain. The rebellion collapsed, and to cement control, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria Ariana, present-day Herat, one of over a dozen cities that would bear his name. Yet even as he built, Alexander's court was unraveling. At Frata, he uncovered a conspiracy that would alter the very soul of his leadership. Philotas, commander of the Companion cavalry and son of the esteemed General Parmenion, was accused of failing to report an assassination plot. Under torture, he confessed. The punishment was death. But it did not end there. Fearing retaliation from Parmenion, who held command in Ecbatana and controlled vast military resources, Alexander acted decisively and ruthlessly. He dispatched messengers to murder Parmenion in secret before the old general could learn of his son's fate. With this, two of his most trusted commanders were gone, and a new era began. One where loyalty would be measured in fear as much as in love. In 329 BC, Alexander pushed deeper into Bactria, chasing the self-proclaimed King Bessus, who had betrayed Darius. He founded Alexandria Arachosia, modern-day Kandahar, as a southern bastion of Macedonian power. Bessus, betrayed by his own men, was captured and sent back to be executed for regicide. But even without a rival, Alexander found no peace. The deeper he moved into Central Asia, the more elusive victory became. In Sogdiana, tribal warfare replaced open battle. Alexander faced not armies, but ambushes. Cities surrendered only to revolt days later. Guerrilla warfare, alien terrain, and an enemy that melted into the hills at first contact wore down even the most hardened troops. Still, Alexander advanced. He crossed the Jaxartes River, reaching what the Greeks believed to be the edge of the world. There he founded Alexandria Escate, Alexandria the furthest. It was both a frontier post and a symbol of defiance to those who believed his reach would end at the edge of the steppe. The nomadic Scythians, fierce and mobile, soon tested him. But Alexander's tactical brilliance turned the confrontation into a crushing victory. Luring them into battle, he struck with overwhelming force, ending their raids and securing his northern border. For now. Yet the strain of these endless campaigns began to reveal cracks, not in the army, but in Alexander himself. He had begun adopting Persian dress, customs, and titles, a move that unsettled his Macedonian companions. What had started as strategy was becoming identity. To his old friends, he no longer looked like the king they had followed across continents. The tipping point came at Marikanda, modern Samarkand, in a drunken banquet. There, Alexander quarreled with Clitus the Black, the very man who had saved his life at the Granicus. Clitus, emboldened by wine and rage, accused Alexander of forgetting his Macedonian roots and embracing Persian vanity. In a moment of fury, Alexander killed him with his own spear. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Alexander, immediately remorseful, locked himself away for days. He had slain a brother in arms. The army grieved, not just for Clitus, but for the loss of the king they once knew. Alexander was no longer just a general. He had become something else. Distant, godlike, dangerous. Yet the world around him offered no rest. In Bactria, another conspiracy bloomed. A group of royal pages, young noble Macedonians in training, plotted to murder Alexander. Their leader, Hermolaus, acted out of personal resentment. The plot was discovered. The conspirators were tortured and stoned to death, a punishment as brutal as it was public. One name whispered in connection with the plot was Callisthenes, Alexander's official historian, and a relative of Aristotle. Callisthenes had opposed Alexander's efforts to introduce proskynesis, the Persian custom of prostration before a ruler. To Greeks, it was blasphemy. Only gods were worshipped. Callisthenes was arrested, imprisoned, and eventually died, perhaps of disease, perhaps by execution. Another voice of dissent silenced. Amid this tension and blood, something unexpected occurred. In 327 BC, Alexander married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian noble. Their union was both romantic and political, an effort to bind the highlands to his empire. She was young, intelligent, and beautiful, and for the first time Alexander seemed more than a conqueror. He was becoming a builder of dynasties. But peace would not last. Beyond the Bactrian mountains lay the lands of India, unknown to the Greeks, rich with fable and guarded by kings. For most, the campaign would have ended here. But Alexander's ambition had no border. With his back to the west and his eyes on the Indus, he began preparations to march into the land where the sun rose. The journey to the edge of the world had not ended. It had merely changed shape. Where once he pursued empires, he now pursued immortality. Chapter 10. Into India beyond the edge of the known world. In the spring of 327 BC, Alexander's army crested the formidable Hindu Kush, stepping into lands that no Greek soldier had seen before. The mountains loomed like the gates of another world, snow-capped, treacherous, and eternal. Below them lay the rich, river-laced subcontinent of India, or Indica as the Greeks called it. A land of mystery and marvel, of legendary wealth and monstrous armies, said to possess hundreds of elephants and warriors beyond counting. The campaign into India was not just a military venture, it was a mythic expedition. To Alexander, this was terra incognita, the edge of the world the old Greek geographers had whispered about. Every step forward was a step into fable, and every skirmish, a test of divine favor. He divided his army into two columns, navigating narrow valleys, swollen rivers, and dense forests as they pressed eastward. First came the wars with the Aspasii, Gurians, and Assassini, tribes of the Swat and Buner valleys who resisted with fierce bravery. Their stone fortresses clung to cliffs, Their archers rained fire from above. But Alexander, undeterred, used siege engines and scaling ladders to drag victory from impossible angles. The city of Macedonia, ruled by a warrior queen, became a symbol of this brutal struggle. Some legends say he spared her life and even fathered a son with her, though the city itself was razed. These battles were costly and exhausting. The enemy never presented open-field engagements, but instead forced Alexander into hill warfare, draining, relentless, and difficult to control. Yet each stronghold he captured extended his myth further, making the name Alexander echo from village to village, now whispered in awe and fear. At Taxila, the tide shifted. King Amhi, aware of Alexander's power, welcomed him with open arms. It was not subjugation, but strategic alliance. Amhi provided guides, elephants, supplies, and access to the lush plains of the Punjab, where Alexander would meet his most formidable opponent yet, Porus, king of the Pauravas. Porus was no minor chieftain, a towering figure in every sense. He ruled a disciplined kingdom, and when summoned to submit, he answered with silence. Instead, he assembled a mighty army on the banks of the Hydaspes River, modern-day Jhelum, and waited for the invader. His war elephants, over 200 strong, were arrayed in a massive line, each beast a tower of flesh and iron. Between them stood archers, chariots, and dense blocks of infantry. The river itself was in flood, fast and deep. Most commanders would have waited, but Alexander, as ever, preferred audacity. One stormy night, under the cover of rain and mist, he led a portion of his army across the river at a secret upstream ford. When dawn broke, Porus found Alexander behind his lines. The Battle of the Hydaspes was a thunderous clash of civilizations. The elephants crashed into the Macedonian phalanx, trampling men, tossing shields into the air. The Macedonians had never faced such creatures before. Spears shattered on thick hides. Horses panicked. Still, they held their ground, maneuvering, flanking, targeting the elephants' vulnerable underbellies and the mahouts who guided them. Alexander, as always, led from the front. He commanded with precision, responding to chaos with calculation. His cavalry outmaneuvered Porus's flanks, turning the battlefield into a whirlwind of dust and blood. The elephants, now panicked and wounded, turned on their own ranks. What had begun as Porus's strength became his undoing. But Alexander was not cruel in victory. When Porus was brought before him, wounded, tall, and unbowed, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, "Like a king." Impressed by his bravery, Alexander restored his kingdom and made him a satrap. It was a hallmark of his rule. Defeat the proud, then honor them, making their loyalty personal and lasting. Despite the triumph, the cost was staggering. The Hydaspes had bled Macedonian strength. Men began to murmur. The promised edge of the world seemed to keep retreating with every mile. Stories reached them of the Nanda Empire further east. Armies 10 times the size of Porus's, elephants like fortresses and endless jungles. For the first time, the soldiers' courage faltered. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, now Bias, Alexander announced his plan to march further. But his army, sunburned, wounded, and exhausted, refused. 8 years of war, thousands of miles from home, and the looming specter of yet another colossal enemy had broken even the hardiest veteran. Alexander pleaded, argued, even withdrew in isolation, hoping to shame them into consent. But the will of the men was firm. At last, Alexander conceded. He ordered altars to be built along the Hyphasis, monuments to ambition halted, symbols that the world had been challenged, even if not fully conquered. It was not surrender. It was a strategic pause. Turning back, he charted a new course. Down the Indus River, through the heart of the lands he had claimed. This leg of the journey would be no retreat, but a continued conquest of cities, tribes, and rivers themselves. Yet fate had not finished testing him. In the land of the Malians, while scaling a city wall during an assault, Alexander was struck in the chest by an arrow, a wound so deep it pierced his lung. He collapsed as blood filled his armor. Rumors of his death rippled through the camp like lightning. But the king, unbelievably, impossibly, survived. Within days he rose again. Though pale and weak, he appeared before his troops to silence their fears. For many, it was a sign. Not even death could touch Alexander. He had passed beyond maps into the realm of legend. And as the army flowed downriver toward the Arabian Sea, one truth remained. The world behind them had changed forever, but the world ahead still called, and Alexander had no intention of ignoring its voice. Chapter 11. The Return Journey Through the Burning Sands. The conquest of India had pushed Alexander's empire to its geographic and human limits. As his fleet prepared to sail from the mouth of the Indus River, the victorious king stood on the shore, gazing westward, not with relief, but with longing. He had reached the edge of the world and survived. But now came the hardest journey of all, returning home. Alexander divided his forces. A portion of the army, under the trusted Nearchus, would sail through the Persian Gulf to chart a new maritime route, an ambitious voyage through waters largely unknown to the Greeks. The rest, including Alexander himself, would take the overland route through the Gadrosian Desert, a vast, merciless expanse in what is now southern Pakistan and Iran. Why Alexander chose this brutal path remains a mystery. Some say he sought to outdo the Persian kings who had failed to cross it. Others suggest it was a logistical necessity, or even a display of divine ambition. Whatever the reason, it would become one of the most harrowing episodes of his campaign. The Gadrosian Desert was a land of extremes, barren, blistering, and devoid of water. The heat baked the earth into cracked stone, and winds scoured the skin like blades. Food grew scarce. Wells were dry or poisoned. The baggage animals perished by the thousands. Men dropped in their tracks, delirious, hallucinating under the merciless sun. Entire units were reduced to scattered, starving survivors. Alexander, unlike many kings, endured the hardship alongside his men. He refused water unless there was enough for all. He carried the wounded, burned the baggage, and walked when others collapsed. Still, even his iron resolve could not prevent the suffering. Of the tens of thousands who entered the desert, a third may have died. When the shattered remnants emerged into the Persian provinces, they looked more like ghosts than conquerors. But they had done the impossible. They had crossed one of the harshest regions on earth, and in doing so, bound the eastern edge of the empire back to its center. At Carmania, Alexander was reunited with Nearchus and his fleet, which had survived storms, shipwrecks, and uncharted currents. The successful naval expedition was hailed as a triumph equal to any land victory. It proved that the seas between India and Persia could be navigated, opening routes that would enrich the Hellenistic world for generations. But even as the empire rejoiced, Alexander's mind turned inward. During his long absence in the east, many of his governors and satraps had grown corrupt, exploiting their positions, looting temples, and abusing power. Now, with his return, he demanded accountability. A wave of purges swept the empire. Officials were executed. Soldiers loyal to those disgraced were disbanded. Justice, as Alexander saw it, was swift and merciless. But to others, it reeked of paranoia, an emperor now isolated, mistrustful, and changing in ways they no longer understood. At Susa, he staged an event as symbolic as it was strategic, the mass wedding. In a grand ceremony, 80 of his officers were married to Persian noblewomen, binding Greek and Persian bloodlines. Alexander himself married 2 Persian princesses, daughters of Darius and Artaxerxes. The message was clear. This was no longer a Macedonian empire. It was a new world, ruled by a fusion of East and West. He ordered 30,000 Persian youths to be trained in Macedonian warfare. He dressed in Persian robes. He adopted court rituals. But with each new step, he alienated his Macedonian troops further. Many grumbled that their king no longer resembled the warrior they had followed from Pella. At Opis, this discontent erupted into full-blown mutiny. The soldiers resented the influx of Persians into the army, the favoritism shown to Eastern customs, and their own fading significance. Alexander, furious, dismissed them, declaring he no longer needed them, that he had fathers now from other lands. The silence that followed was profound, and then, grief-stricken, the soldiers begged forgiveness. They had loved their king but no longer recognized him. Alexander, moved, reconciled with his men, declaring that all who had shared in the hardships of the campaign, regardless of birth, would be equal in his empire. But fate, never far from the edge of tragedy, struck again. At Ecbatana, his closest companion and perhaps the love of his life, Hephaestion, fell ill and died. The grief shattered Alexander. He refused food. He ordered a mourning that spread across the empire. Statues were erected, cities renamed. For a moment, it seemed even the conqueror of worlds could not conquer sorrow. He turned to war again, to distraction, to purpose. He launched a final campaign into the mountains of Cassia, defeating a tribe that had resisted both Persians and Greeks for centuries. It was victory, but empty. The fire that once drove him now smoldered beneath a weight of loss and legacy. In Babylon, embassies arrived from distant lands: Ethiopians, Scythians, Libyans, Gauls, even tribes from Italy and Iberia. They came not to resist, but to acknowledge his supremacy. Alexander stood at the center of the known world, a ruler of unparalleled reach. But instead of celebrating, he began planning yet another campaign, this time to Arabia, the last corner untouched by his empire. Yet something lingered in the air, a shadow, a silence. As he prepared his next conquest, Alexander fell ill. Fever gripped him. He grew weaker by the day. His generals waited anxiously. No clear successor had been named. Whispers spread. Was it malaria? Typhoid? Poison? Within days, the man who had never lost a battle was dead, silent, breathless, and gone before his empire had truly taken root. He was 32 years old, but in the short span of 13 years, he had redrawn the map of the world. The return from India had broken many men, but for Alexander it had transformed him. From warrior to emperor, from mortal to legend, from man to myth. His body would lie in mystery, his name would echo through time, and the empire he forged would never be whole again. Chapter 12. Death of a King, the Shattering of a Legacy. Babylon, the city of wonders, basked under a golden sun the day Alexander fell ill. The great halls of the palace whispered with unease. Rumors swirled like desert winds, of omens, of bad dreams, of vultures nesting on temple walls. The man who had walked through fire and blood, who had defied death at the Granicus, Issus, and Hydaspes, now lay silent, consumed by a fever no enemy had managed to deliver on the battlefield. In those final days, Alexander drifted in and out of consciousness. His generals stood by, uncertain, unwilling to accept what seemed inevitable. When asked to whom he left his vast empire, his voice, frail and slurred, gave the only answer that history preserved: to the strongest. With that, he passed. A king without a successor, a god in the eyes of many, gone without a plan. His death sent shockwaves through his court. There was no clear heir. His only legitimate son, Alexander IV, was not yet born. His wife Roxana pregnant and vulnerable. In a desperate power play, she had Darius's other daughter, Alexander's second wife, murdered, eliminating any rival bloodline. But the chaos had already begun. With no central authority, his generals, known as the Diadochi or Successors, turned on each other. They had marched together across continents, but now ambition eclipsed loyalty. Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, and Cassander each carved up territories, raising armies not in Alexander's name, but in their own. What had once been a unified dream of fusion and empire dissolved into decades of civil war. The infant Alexander IV and Roxana became political pawns. For a time, the generals maintained the illusion of unity by ruling in his name. But it was short-lived. In the shadows of politics and power, both mother and child were eventually murdered, ensuring that no one with Alexander's blood would ever sit on his throne. Even Alexander's body became a symbol of power. While en route to Macedon for burial, his golden sarcophagus was seized by Ptolemy, who diverted it to Egypt, enshrining it in the city that bore the conqueror's name, Alexandria. There, it became a pilgrimage site, a political trophy, and eventually a mystery. Over time, its location was lost to history. Today, the tomb of the greatest conqueror the world has ever known remains undiscovered. What Alexander left behind was not an empire in the traditional sense. It was an idea larger than borders and bloodlines. He had envisioned a world united not by force alone, but by shared culture. In every city he founded, from Alexandria in Egypt to Alexandria Eskate in Central Asia, he planted seeds of Hellenistic civilization. Greek language, art, and philosophy blended with local customs, giving rise to a new era, the Hellenistic Age. This fusion reshaped the ancient world. In Egypt, the Ptolemies built libraries and temples that blended Greek and pharaonic traditions. In Mesopotamia, Seleucid kings ruled cities where Greek theaters stood beside Zoroastrian altars. In India, Greek-influenced kingdoms emerged, producing statues of the Buddha in Greek robes and coinage with bilingual inscriptions. The empire had fallen, but its cultural ripples extended for centuries. Yet the irony remained. The man who had united such vast lands left behind nothing that could hold them together. His genius, charisma, and vision had been the glue. Without him, the mosaic fractured. Each general sought to outdo the other, not to fulfill Alexander's legacy, but to claim it. Still, the memory of Alexander endured. Roman emperors worshipped his image. Napoleon carried his histories into battle. Generals studied his tactics. Cities still bear his name. And storytellers, from ancient scribes to modern filmmakers, continue to ask, how did a man so young shape the fate of half the known world? He was a warrior and a builder, a philosopher king and a ruthless destroyer. He spoke of unity yet ruled by the sword. He embraced foreign gods, yet demanded divine worship. He inspired awe and fear, love and rebellion. He was Alexander, the Great, and though the world he carved fell to pieces, the legend he built never did. Chapter 13. The Wars of the Successors, a Fractured Empire. With Alexander's death in 323 BC, the empire he had forged with blood and brilliance collapsed like a marble statue struck at the base. There was no guiding hand to hold it together, no air strong enough to tame the storm that followed. His generals, the very men who had marched beside him across deserts, rivers, and mountain ranges, now turned their swords against one another. The dream of unity died with its dreamer. These men, the Diadochi or Successors, were titans in their own right. Ptolemy, the pragmatic and cunning, Seleucus, the strategist, Antigonus, the warrior king, Lysimachus, the opportunist, and Cassander, the cold and calculating. What began as a power-sharing agreement quickly devolved into chaos. Each general claimed loyalty to Alexander's son, the infant Alexander IV, but their true ambition was clear, to rule in their own name. The empire was split like a carcass among lions. Ptolemy seized Egypt, establishing himself in Alexandria and claiming Alexander's body as a symbol of legitimacy. Seleucus carved out Babylonia and the East, laying the foundation for what would become the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus sought to dominate Asia Minor, while Cassander declared himself king of Macedonia and Greece, strangling any remaining loyalty to Alexander's bloodline. Wars raged across the former empire. Sieges, betrayals, and assassinations became the currency of power. Alliances were forged in haste and broken with ease. Entire cities were razed. Armies made up of former brothers-in-arms now slaughtered one another in the fields of Ipsus, Gaza, and Corupedium. The bloodshed seemed endless, as if the land itself mourned the loss of the man who had once brought it to heel. In this chaos, the fate of Roxana and Alexander IV, the widow and child of the great king, grew grim. Initially protected as royal symbols, they became dangerous liabilities as power shifted hands. Cassander, eager to remove any challenge to his throne, had them quietly executed, erasing the last direct link to Alexander's lineage. The empire no longer even pretended to be united. Despite the wars and fragmentation, Alexander's cultural vision survived. The cities he founded continued to flourish. Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual capital of the ancient world, home to the great library and scholars from every land. Greek art, language, and architecture spread across the East, merging with local traditions. In India, Indo-Greek kingdoms blossomed, minting coins with Greek gods on one side and Indian deities on the other. What emerged was a world profoundly changed. The Hellenistic kingdoms, though politically divided, shared a common cultural thread, woven during Alexander's conquests. The blending of East and West sparked new philosophies, advances in science, and art that would echo for centuries. The Greeks had become citizens of the world. Yet even as the Diadochi claimed fragments of Alexander's world, none could claim his spirit. They ruled as kings, but none were called great. Their empires endured, some for decades, others for centuries, but all eventually fell to civil war, foreign invasion, or the rising star of a new Western power, Rome. Rome admired Alexander. Julius Caesar wept at the foot of his statue, lamenting that he had done so little by the age when Alexander had done so much. The Roman legions would one day overrun the lands Alexander once ruled, but even they could not erase the memory of the man who had united Greece, Egypt, Persia, and parts of India under a single name. In the end, the wars of the successors were not merely a fight for territory, they were a struggle for identity. Each general tried to wear Alexander's legacy like a cloak, but none could fill it. His empire had not been a system, it was a personality. And once that force of nature was gone, the empire reverted to what it had been before. Many lands, many peoples, many kings. Still, in every marketplace where coins bore his face, in every column where Greek inscriptions lined eastern walls, in every child who learned of his deeds from Egypt to the Oxus River, Alexander remained. Not as a ruler but as a legend. And even as his generals died, and their empires crumbled, his name endured like granite, etched into the foundations of history. Chapter 14. The Hellenistic World, Echoes of Alexander's Dream. Though Alexander's empire fractured into rival kingdoms, his shadow loomed large over the ancient world. From the sands of Egypt to the mountains of Central Asia, his conquests had planted the seeds of a new civilization, the Hellenistic world. It was not a land defined by borders, but by culture, a fusion of Greek ideals with Eastern traditions, of science and superstition, of cities and sages. In death, Alexander had given birth to an age that bore his unmistakable imprint. This world was not unified politically, but connected intellectually and spiritually. Greek became the language of trade, diplomacy, and learning from Athens to Bactria. Sculptures of Apollo stood in temples beside Zoroastrian fire altars. Egyptian pharaohs took Greek names, and Eastern kings hired Greek architects to build theaters and gymnasiums in desert cities. The world had become a mosaic of hybrid identities, where gods wore new faces and knowledge passed freely across once hostile frontiers. Nowhere was this synthesis more vivid than in Alexandria, Egypt, the city Alexander had founded at the mouth of the Nile. Under Ptolemaic rule, it blossomed into a metropolis of unmatched influence. The Library of Alexandria, with its ambition to collect all human knowledge, attracted scholars from across the world. Mathematicians like Euclid, astronomers like Eratosthenes, and philosophers like Plotinus walked its halls. It was a city of learning, of exploration of ideas, a living embodiment of Alexander's vision. Meanwhile, in the east, Seleucus I, one of Alexander's most capable generals, forged a vast empire stretching from Syria to the Industry. In cities like Seleucia, Antioch, and Aeconum, Greek theaters and temples stood among Zoroastrian and Babylonian ruins. The fusion was not always peaceful, but it was real. Greek and local cultures did not merely coexist. They merged, creating something entirely new. Even in faraway India, the ripple of Alexander's passage endured. The Indo-Greek kingdoms in the northwest flourished, with rulers like Menander I adopting Buddhist beliefs. In sculpture and art, the Greco-Buddhist style emerged, Buddha depicted in flowing robes, with Hellenic facial features and a calm, introspective pose drawn from classical sculpture. Alexander had brought the spear, but what lingered was dialogue, architecture, art, and thought. This cultural explosion did not erase local traditions. Rather, it elevated them, offering new mediums, new techniques, and a broader audience. Eastern wisdom enriched Western philosophy. Greek science evolved under Babylonian and Egyptian influence. Medicine, astronomy, geometry, and literature all advanced in this new world born of conquest but nurtured in peace. Yet the Hellenistic world was not without its fractures. The successor kingdoms, though grand in ambition, were constantly at war, their borders shifting with the whims of dynasties and generals. The dream of unity had faded. The romance of Alexander's empire gave way to political intrigue and dynastic decay. Over time, the Hellenistic realms became vulnerable to a new, rising force, Rome. The Roman Republic, and later the Roman Empire, absorbed much of what Alexander had left behind. But even as Rome expanded, it embraced Hellenism rather than destroy it. Roman nobles learned Greek. Roman temples borrowed from Greek designs. Roman generals studied Alexander's campaigns. He became the gold standard of military greatness, a hero of legend even among the conquerors who succeeded him. Still, the question lingered through the centuries. Was Alexander's dream fulfilled, or did it die with him? The empire he created had vanished, but the world he envisioned, of East and West intertwined, had not. His cities survived. His language endured. His influence rippled through time like a stone dropped in the center of history's vast lake. Even in failure, his ambition reshaped the planet. Few men in history have done more by 32, and perhaps none have left behind a paradox so profound. A conqueror who sought peace, a warrior who built libraries, a foreigner who became native to every land he touched. In the Hellenistic age, Alexander lived on, not in gold or marble, but in ideas, art, and aspiration. He had not just conquered an empire. He had rewritten the rules of civilization. Chapter 15, Immortality, the Eternal Legacy of Alexander the Great. More than 2,000 years have passed since Alexander drew his final breath in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. Yet his name remains immortal, a word fused not only to his title but to his very story. Few figures in history have been as widely emulated, studied, or mythologized. He was a king, a conqueror, a visionary, and something more, a symbol of human potential stretched to its furthest edge. His image endured not just in stone or coin, but in the imagination of civilizations. Roman emperors worshipped his memory. Generals like Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, and even George Patton kept his histories close. They marveled not only at what he accomplished but at the fire that seemed to consume him. A drive so relentless it transcended borders, cultures, even mortality itself. Yet for all the statues, temples, and titles, Alexander's legacy was not simply military. His campaigns had unleashed a cultural transformation unlike anything before. The birth of a global consciousness in the ancient world. Ideas moved with his armies, philosophy, medicine, language, architecture, and art. What began as conquest evolved into connection, bridging the Mediterranean with India, Greece with Persia, the West with the East. His dream of unity was flawed, yes, flawed by ambition, arrogance, and the human limits he refused to see. He destroyed cities, executed rivals, and demanded divine honors. He was not a saint, nor a man of peace. But he also founded over 20 cities, many of which became thriving centers of culture for centuries. He spread literacy, ideas, and trade routes that connected worlds previously divided by geography and fear. In each region he touched, Alexander became someone different. In Egypt, he was Pharaoh, son of Ammonius. In Persia, he became a Shahanshah, king of kings. In India, he stood as a demigod, etched into oral epics. To Greeks, he remained the heroic ideal, the new Achilles, driven not by rage but by boundless vision. Even his enemies wrote of him with reluctant awe. Perhaps the most enduring mystery is not what he conquered, but why he kept going. He had gold, glory, and empire, yet he pressed on, toward the Himalayas, toward the deserts of Arabia, toward death. It was not for riches. It was not even for power. It was for the edge of the world, that elusive horizon just beyond reach, that eternal hunger for something more. This is what elevates Alexander beyond the realm of kings and into the realm of myth. He was the ultimate seeker, a man who refused to accept the limits of his time, of his age, of his body. He stared into the unknown and walked forward, again and again. And though his empire would crumble, his legend would not. It would only grow, passed from mouth to manuscript, from scroll to screen, from century to century. His tomb, once the destination of emperors and scholars, is now lost to history. Its location unknown, its treasures buried in silence. Yet the world itself is his monument. His name lives in cities. His story lives in books. His face still peers from coins and statues. And in every tale of bold ambition, of impossible odds defied, Alexander's ghost walks behind the words. In the final reckoning, Alexander the Great was not just a man of his time. He was a force against time, an explosion of will that defied the boundaries of nation, culture, and mortality. He burned bright and he burned fast, but the flame he lit still flickers in the minds of all who dare to dream beyond the world they inherit. And that is the truest conquest of all.